You could actually get dizzy going through this week's Torah portion. Moshe is going up and down the mountain 3 times. Each time, 40 days and 40 nights. The Medrash, the sages tell us that he wasn't eating, sleeping, or drinking during those 40 days. Why 40 days? Particularly the first set of days. What's he doing up there? God is giving him the Torah, teaching him the Torah with all of its intricacies. But that should actually take more than 40 days. God must have compressed that time. But once he's going to compress that time, why not narrow it down instead of 40 days to 4 seconds? Just take that godly finger and zap the Torah and all of its laws straight into Moshe's head and then send them back down the mountain. Because think of the risk. 40 days is a pretty long time. The Jews are down at the base of the mountain, no civilization. They're in the wilderness. They got a lot of gold on their hands that they've taken from the Egyptians. Who knows what trouble they could get into? They might melt that gold and make a golden calf. Sure enough, that's what happens. So why did God keep Moshe on the mountain for 40 days and 40 nights instead of just teaching him the Torah in an instant, in an eye blink? Because he wanted to show him and show us that if you want to study the Torah properly and internalize its messages, you need a relationship. You need a study partner. So God wasn't just teaching the Torah to Moshe. He was studying the Torah with Moshe, bichavrusa, as study partners in a relationship. And to this day, if you go into a yeshiva, you'll see that the students spend most of their day studying bichavrusa, in twos, as study partners. You have a great idea, a great argument, a great line of thinking. You got to see if it passes muster. You have to put it through the crucible. You have to run the gauntlet. You have to see what your study partner thinks. He may agree. He may disagree. He may take your argument and chop it up into little pieces, drop it on the floor and jump up and down on top of it. And you have to go back to the drawing board. A little humbling, but you'll be better off for it. The best example of this comes from the story in the Talmud that tells us about the relationship between the great sage Rav Yochanan and his disciple Reish Lakish. Reish Lakish started off as the protege of Rav Yochanan, but then eventually became one of the great sages in his own right, and he became chavrusas, study partners, for years. Their agreements and disagreements are recorded throughout the Talmud, until the tragic end of Reish Lakish's life. He dies, and his study partner Rav Yochanan is distraught. And the sages find a replacement for Reish Lakish. They bring an incredibly brilliant sage to learn with Rav Yochanan. And he's still not happy. Why not? He explains, every time I say something, this new study partner of mine brings me a proof that I'm right. Well, what's wrong with that? That sounds pretty good. I think I'd like that. Every time I say something, somebody says, I'll prove you're right. He says, you know what used to happen when I learned with Reish Lakish? Every time I'd say something, he'd bring 24 proofs that I was wrong. That's what I needed. That's how he clarified the law. I don't need to be told that I'm right. I know what I said. I need to be shown the error of my ways. That's how I refine my thought process. And that's how I narrow down ideas and discard the ones that seemed good at the outset, but in the end weren't standing on as solid ground as I thought they were. And so I get it. You like to watch videos about Torah topics. That's fantastic. And you like to study texts, even better. But if you're studying them on your own, oh, are you missing out? You need a study partner. God could have written the best book ever. He did, the Torah. But he could have also written the best book ever, including the written law, the Torah, and the oral law, with the best table of contents and the best index ever. And anytime you'd have a question in any generation, you'd just look it up and you'd get the answer. And that book would gather dust, because that would be boring. Instead, when you have that back and forth, when you have the war of the Torah between sparring chavrusas, study partners who will argue and argue and argue, and then of course get up as best friends, go get a coffee together, that is when you own it. That's when you remember it. That's when you internalize it. That's when it becomes deep and meaningful. that's when it becomes alive and exciting. And then you can pass that excitement down, generation to generation, grandparents to their children, to the grandchildren, throughout the ages.